Thank you, Angie. That really means a lot to me, and I will say because in graduate school, as a young graduate student, Angie's papers and her work was really, really, really influential to me, and it still is. And so the work that you guys see me present today has been largely influenced by the work that Angie and many of you all have done, here at Michigan State. So it's a huge honor to have that introduction. But as Angie said today, I'm going to talk to you guys about hybrid spaces and third places. So for Scientizing with mobile, wearable, and community technologies. This is kind of a new talk for me. I recently just submitted my materials for tenure, and so that kind of helps you to kind of think about who you are as a researcher and kind of the big picture of what you do. So I'm going to try to present my work from that perspective, and so hopefully it all fits together. But you guys can feel free to ask questions. If there are things that don't make sense, or if you have questions at the end, I would love that. So the way that the talk is organized is that I will start by giving you an introduction to myself and the goals that I have for my work. I'll then tell you about work that I'm doing in the context of hybrid spaces with a project called BodyViz. And then next I'll tell you about work that I'm doing in the context of third places with two projects. One is called Science Everywhere and one is called NatureNet. And then finally I will conclude with my future dreams and goals. So a little bit about myself. I am an HCI and learning sciences researcher. I used to think I was more of a learning scientist than I was an HCI researcher, but I've come to see myself as kind of half and half, more half and half than I thought I was originally. What that means for me is that I design new technologies and learning experiences to help people see and do science in their everyday lives. And I draw heavily on participatory design, specifically cooperative inquiry methodologies for engaging kids as equal partners in the design process of new technologies and learning experiences for children. So my goal in my work is to do what I call scientizing. So when someone scientizes, they begin to see science and the relevance of science in their everyday lives. So what that means is that they begin to find practical applications for science in their everyday lives, and when they see those practical applications, they begin to use science to achieve their own personally meaningful and relevant goals. So in essence, what I'm trying to do is help people begin to see the world through scientific lenses. And so I found in my previous work that there are several building blocks from the literature and then from my own work in communities, that there are several building blocks to helping people to develop these scientizing dispositions. First, there's the procedural and conceptual understanding that's needed for helping people to have the competence to engage in science and do science when they find it relevant. But there's also the interest that people need to have, or this curiosity about the world, and wanting to know more about the world and how it works. But then there's also the social interactions that you need to have. You need to engage with people and have a community of people who care about science and scientific inquiry practices and who want to hear and engage with you in these practices. And then finally, there are the personal connections that are necessary for helping people to have the commitment to engage in science and to do science, even when it's not the most convenient or obvious thing to be doing. And so what I aim to do in my work then is to help people to have experiences that bring these building blocks of disposition development together in new ways to promote scientizing. And so we found that social media technologies and new media more generally can provide lots of rich potential for supporting scientific scientizing experiences. So take, for example, this social media post, a video post that a young learner made in our social media app as he was participating in our summer camp program. He was just sitting at the breakfast table with some of his friends, and he made this post.
Okay, my question is, do milk have sugar? Well, when I looked, it only had, it said, hold on, yeah, no ingredient is right here. Why would milk have sugar? If that thing drops on it, so it don't have sugar. It got
meet back over on the couch.
a flat bait and vitamin B as well. It don't have sugar. So
And so we see in this example, right, the learner's not going deep into scientific content, but what he is doing is he's starting to ask his own questions, right, in everyday life context. And he's beginning to collect data to begin to make claims about those questions that he's then presenting to a community of his peers. And so this is the potential of new media for promoting scientizing experiences, and this is what I aim to do in my work. So then the question that I asked is, how can these mobile, wearable, community technologies support children's scientizing in everyday life? And so that brings us to the first context of hybrid spaces in the BodyViz project. And so what we're looking at in this project is what kinds of, how can hybrid spaces provide new spaces for wearable-based inquiry that supports scientizing experiences. And so I have a really amazing team to work on this project with, including my collaborator and PI, John Freilich, who is a computer science professor at the University of Washington. He just recently moved there from Maryland, so I miss him very dearly. But we have also a great team of graduate students and undergraduate students from education, from the iSchool, and from computer science. And so hybrid spaces are these spaces where that integrate aspects of learners' personal lives, right, their home cultures, their individual interests, and their scientific practices, right? And Angie's done a lot of work in this area that, like as I said, has been very inspirational for me. And we've seen ways that new technologies can provide opportunities for hybrid spaces, and BodyViz actually turned out to be one of them. But we actually didn't start there, right? So usually in my work, I start with some big, big science learning question, right? How can we help children do this scientizing and things like that? But this project actually started with an opportunity, right? So really, we wanted to know, we saw an opportunity with new technologies that we wanted to explore. Specifically, we were wondering, well, what if our clothes could tell us how our bodies function? Right? Like, how could that change the way that children learn about their bodies? And could a t-shirt really become a platform for scientific inquiry and investigation? And so with that, we designed the BodyViz tool, and in fact, a suite of tools that we call Live Physiological Sensing and Visualization Tools. And we shortened that because that is a mouthful. So we shortened that to call them LPSV tools. And what they do is they sense and visualize a wearer's physiological functioning in real time. So we have two LPSV tools. They both work with a Zephyr bioharness, which is a sensor that kids strap to their waist. It has to touch the skin. And then that bioharness actually collects their heart rate data and their breathing rate data and projects it in two ways. So the first way is an analytic representation called SharedPhys, where it shows the kids, up to 6 wearers can wear bioharnesses, and their heart rate data is visualized on a line graph in real time, and they can compare with one another. So here you can see it in real time.
About 185 or 190.
So the graph is moving in real time with the kids' heart rate so that they can see it. The second visualization is called BodyViz. It's an e-textile shirt, and it actually provides a model-based representation of children's their hearts, their lungs, all their upper respiratory organs. And the heart actually lights up according to the wearer's heart rate, and then the lungs light up according to the breathing rate. It also has a simulation that's not real time, but it simulates the child eating, and it shows as food goes down the esophagus and into the liver and the stomach actually has a phone in it, so it actually shows a simulation of the stomach breaking down the food and go into the small intestines and the large intestines. We did participatory design with kids, so the shirt also farts at the end of the at the end of the digestive system simulation. But so really what we're trying to do with these tools is we're trying to leverage the body as a platform for inquiry, right? And so with inquiry, we're specifically focusing on helping the kids begin to ask questions, to collect data, to analyze that data, and begin to make claims to answer their questions. Right, and so this actually provides a really rich context for hybrid spaces, because the kids are able to connect their home cultures and individual interests, right? They're in their everyday life activity, what it means for their physical bodies, with scientific practices and investigations, right? And scientific data forms and data interpretation and things like that. And sensor-based learning has actually shown us the potential of this approach, right? So sensor-based learning tools have been developed over the past decade, right? That sense things like temperature, that sense things like light and things like that, and help children to learn from those particular types of experiences. So it's shown that these types of experiences can promote children's inquiry and conceptual learning, and it can also begin to support their dispositions and identity development in new ways. But many times, these particular studies are limited in that they suggest the potential of these particular things, but they're often very lab-based, and they focus only on pre- and post-test analyses, and they focus on shorter-term assessments, so you don't really get to focus, right, on what the real potential for that type of meaning-making is. So we didn't do a longitudinal study of this, of body viz, but we did do a 4-day evaluation where children use our tools over a sequence of 4 days to engage in inquiry investigations. So they use both the body viz and shared viz tools over the 4-day sequence, and we actually did, we worked in classrooms in a 1st grade, a 2nd grade, and a 4th grade classroom with these 4-day evaluations. And we did participatory design with teachers and with kids to both design the shared viz and body viz tools, but also to design the learning activities that the kids did with the tools, so that 4-day sequence of activities. And so we're really trying to understand how these LPSV ecosystems can support children's scientizing practices, right? So how could it support their scientific inquiry? How could it support them within and across grade levels? And so specifically within the context of a formal classroom, right? Like how do these ecosystems take shape within those contexts? So in order to understand that, we use activity theory, right? And Susan's back here shaking her head. We went to graduate school together, and this is one of the theories and the things that we talk about a lot in graduate school. This is my qualitative research buddy back here. So activity theory was used, it really helps us to understand how tools, people, and social groups and norms actually come together to support a particular object or goal or activity. So for us, in the LPSV context, right, that means that we're trying to understand how the LPSV tools and the supporting artifacts around those tools come together with the learners, as well as the social norms in the classroom, right? The classroom government, the social context and collaboration, as well as teacher and facilitator roles. How all of those things come together then to support children's life-relevant scientific inquiry. Right? And so that's what we're trying to understand, right? How do all of these aspects come together to form an ecosystem that support children's scientizing experiences? So then in the 4-day sequence of activities, what we do is children first have a chance to explore the tools and to think about questions that they have about their bodies, right? Like, what do you want to know about your body and how it functions? And they can actually explore the tools and play with them and see how they work. On the 2nd day, the children actually get to go deeper into exploration, and we do a semi-structured set of activities with them where they actually brainstorm activities that would make their heart rates go really, really, really high, and activities that would make their heart rates go really, really, really low, and then they use the tools to test out their hypotheses. But on the 3rd day, the children actually begin to design their own new experiences and investigations. So they can ask their own questions that they can use the body viz and shared viz tools to answer, and then on the final day, they present their results. So we did this sequence of activities with children in the 1st, 2nd, and 4th grade classrooms, and we worked at a local urban public elementary school where over 90% of the children came from populations that were underrepresented in STEM, and over 65% of the children received free and reduced lunch. We had 62 total participants, about half and half, male and female, 11 undisclosed, and we had about 20 kids participating in our study in each classroom. The 4th grade class was a little bit bigger than the 2nd and the 1st grade classes, but this represents the number of people that agreed to be in our study. So in this context, we collected a wide range of data, from video data to interviews of the teachers, the focus groups of learners, and things like that, and we actually used structural coding to code this data according to our questions. So for example, with the video data, we looked to see what types of interactions the kids were having with the artifacts, the things that motivated those interactions, as well as the scientific practices and the life relevant experiences that they were having. We did this across all the data forms, and we brought this together in one big, huge meta matrix axial coding round for activity theory, using the activity theory lens to bring the data together and highlight specific themes. So we found themes in two categories: the scientific inquiry practices and life relevant learning experiences. We actually found 6 themes total for this analysis, but because of time, I'm only going to tell you about 3. You can read our paper in CHI 2017 for more about that. But in terms of scientific inquiry, the first theme that we found was that there was a difference between grade levels. And we saw this as we looked at the children's use of the LPSV tools and the social collaboration in the classroom. So specifically, we saw that first and second graders were much more attuned to the model-based representations on the body of their shirt. They wanted to play with the shirt and see how the organs interacted and things like that, kind of see the simulation and those kinds of things. Whereas the fourth graders were much more attuned to the scientific inquiry experiences that they were having. So, for example, on the post assessments, 62% of the fourth graders emphasized scientific inquiry aspects of their experiences as being their favorite parts of the activities, whereas only 25 and 24% of first and second grade graders reported that. However, across both sections, what we noticed was that there were these tensions that the kids faced between the life relevant aspects of the activity and the inquiry, right? So as soon as they see the shared fit system come up, they want to run and they want to jump and do it and do all kinds of stuff to get their heart rates the highest, right? But that often would sacrifice the integrity of their scientific investigation. So then in the fourth grade classes, the fourth graders would actually bring this up themselves. Well, wait a minute, you're not doing it right? Like that's going to mess up our investigation this way and that way. However, the first and second graders, it was harder to get them to see that. The facilitators actually had to bring that up, and even then, it wasn't clear that the kids really understood how those deviations were affecting their investigations. So then the second theme that we saw with respect to scientific inquiry was the importance of space. And that was illustrated as we looked at how the kids use the LPSV tools and the classroom governance. So we specifically found that in the fourth grade class, as I said, was a little bit larger, right? So it had almost 30 kids, which meant a lot more desks, right? And so the kids had a lot less free space in which to use the tools. So we saw a lot of the craning and looking to see, hard to see the screens and hard to see each other with the shirts and kind of engage in the same amounts of activities. Whereas in the first and second grade classes, they had dedicated free space where the kids could use the tools, and so they could run and jump and engage in all the different things. But it was also easier for them to see who the wearers were with shared fits when they didn't have on the shirts. It was also easier for them to look across groups and see and kind of learn from what they saw one another doing. However, even though they had this space, the teachers actually reported that they weren't necessarily comfortable with them using the free space kind of in these ways, right? So the second grade teacher, who took a more structured approach to her classroom management, said, rather than everyone standing in the back watching specific seats, you're going to sit in your seat unless you're wearing the bio harness, right? And so it suggests that she wanted more structure even still in the classroom governance. So then with respect to life-relevant connections to inquiry, we saw that that we specifically needed to leverage the environment, right, to promote those life-relevant aspects, right? And this was clear as we looked at supporting artifacts with the LPSV tools and the social context and collaboration and teacher-facilitator roles. So specifically, we saw that these supporting artifacts like balls and tennis rackets and jump ropes and phones and even food and candy and things like that were necessary for helping the children to engage in their scientific investigations because they wanted to know how these things affected their heart rates and their breathing rates. And also we saw that community aspects, right? So things like pop culture, but also community aspects in the classroom, right? So for example, in the first grade class, there was a pregnant teacher. Right, and so the kids want to know, well, how is my heart rate different than a pregnant person's, right? So that affected the questions that they asked, right? And then it was important with respect to classroom governance that the teacher allowed them to have access to these materials, and often these aren't materials that you have access to in the classroom, right? because sometimes they're throwing things and things like that. It could be dangerous for some of the other things you have in the room, and candy and phones and things like that are often not allowed. So they needed to have access to those things, though, in order to have these life-relevant connections. So these themes present us with several implications with respect to supporting children's life-relevant scientific inquiry experiences. Specifically with respect to designing the LPSV tools, right, to support life-relevant inquiry, it suggests that we think of ways to link the model-based representations more closely to the abstract representations or the analytic representations to help the younger learners who are less attuned to the scientific inquiry processes to begin to make those connections more easily and clearly. But it also suggests that we begin to leverage non-technical artifacts, right, to promote inquiry and investigation in life-relevant ways, right? So we should think not only about the LPSV tools that we include, but we should also think about the supporting artifacts that we might include with them, right? So even teachers might think about pillows and books and things like that that might inspire more quiet investigations as well as the loud, active ones. So then when it comes to integrating the LPSV tools into the classroom environment, our findings suggest that we allow for incremental integration of these variables, right? So especially for the younger learners who were still learning and developing the inquiry skills, right? So maybe having only one person represented on the body viz system at first, and then slowly incrementing to more and things like that. And then finally, we should consider the social and physical constraints and opportunities with respect to the use of space, right? So space is a big consideration, and we should think about how we leverage space in a school and in a classroom to promote this type of inquiry. So then coming back to the question about how activity theory can reveal some tensions with respect to hybrid spaces and sensor-based learning, our findings suggest that we really need to manage these tensions, right, that we face between how the teachers perceive LPSV tools as these nice tools for new inquiry experiences that can facilitate these quiet, reflective, assessment-based experiences, to the way that kids see the tools as these like really highly active and energetic activities and experiences that they can have in the classroom. And we also need to really carefully consider space and layout of the rooms and also the supporting artifacts that we incorporate into these environments. But we need more of these types of analyses, right? So many types of analysis that we see with sensor-based learning tools are focused specifically on the learning gains, right? And we lose sight, right, of the actual classroom ecosystem and how that's affecting children's inquiry experiences and how that can become a hybrid space. But these types of studies, right, they're not easy. So they're messy, they're complex, and they're very hard. I always say I had to stand up on a stool to get to the top of that triangle, right? But it's worth it. It's worth going through the process because we can come out with some of these insights that will make it doable in the classroom. And so then with that, I want to turn to my work in the context of third places, which is a new term for me. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but in the context of the Science Everywhere and NatureNet projects. So up until now, my research has mainly focused on informal learning context, right? So my dissertation work was in the context of an after-school program. The Body Biz project was actually the first time that I did focus, that I did research in a formal learning classroom or learning environment. And I think that this is because of my own experiences growing up as a youth, right? So here you see 8th grade Tammy. and I was really like, I really loved to learn when I was in middle school. And so I loved school, but I also was a very big social person, right? I was a socializer. I didn't want to do it if my friends weren't doing it and things like that. And I often faced these tensions between being smart in the classroom and being cool with my friends. And so if I didn't think it was going to be cool, then I didn't really want to, necessarily be the smart person. But it was community-based programs like the Math and Science Education Network pre-college program in North Carolina, where I grew up, that really helped me to begin to manage these tensions. So in the pre-college program, it was for minority students who were interested in STEM, and we did all kinds of enrichment activities outside of the classroom, right? So we went on field trips, we did competitions and things like that, and I met other people who were interested and engaged in science, but who I thought were also really cool. And so that, for me, helped me to establish a community with shared values and goals, a community of people who value learning and social experiences. And it helped me to find the balance between work and fun in my life. And I think, like many other researchers have pointed out, definitely with Angie and Angie's work with Megan Bang and Joe Coleman and others, it helped me to see the importance of community and community settings for supporting learning, right? So oftentimes when we think about where learning happens and who promotes learning, we focus solely on the classroom, right, or solely in an after-school setting. But if you look at this picture right here, this is actually from my grandmother's 104th birthday, and there she is. She passed away a couple months ago, but this is from her birthday. And you see back here and all these tables surrounding, right, these people who have been very, very influential in my life. And specifically back here at this table, here I want to point out Mr. Gus here. Mr. Gus was a high school coach, and he was our next door neighbors when I was born. And even after we moved, they would still come visit me, and we were friends. And I just remember him always coming over. He was in that high school coach voice tone saying, "Tammy, you are a mathematician, right? Like, you are a mathematician. If you can't do it, nobody can do it." And I probably was nervous about a test or whatever, but he'd be like, "Tammy, no, you can do it." And that really helped me to see that I could do it. And then over here we have Dr. Paul Benning. I call him Mr. P-Paul, but this is Dr. Paul, and he actually is a professor at NC State in science, not science, but in education. And he actually gave me my first opportunity to do undergraduate research. He was the first professor that I met, and I actually grew up knowing him. He's one of my dad's best friends, and he actually gave me an opportunity to do undergraduate research. So none of these people were teachers. Well, actually, maybe some of them are, but they weren't my teachers, right? But they played an influential role in helping me to come to see and do science. And so that's what I want to promote for learners in my community. And so I draw on the notion of the third place. And Susan, this is another concept. This is another concept that she and I learned about in graduate school. But the third place, what it does is it's different from the third space, right? So when we think about third spaces, we're really focusing on the types of learning interactions we want children to have and ways that we can promote those hybrid space interactions, right? So ways that their personal and their social can begin to come together. Well, the third place is actually more of a physical place, right, that people engage in. So Ray Oldenburg was a sociologist who went around to these informal places, and he characterized them as these gathering places where informal life, like laughter and friendship and civic participation, happens naturally, dynamically, and freely, right? And so he wasn't looking at learning, but what I'm saying is that these places are places where we should really be thinking about how learning could happen. And so he says that these third places, they're your libraries, they're your barbershops, your hair salons, they're your churches, they're your basketball courts, your football fields, they're your internet cafes, they're your sports bars and things like that. Places that are not home and they're not school, but they're places that you go to consistently and you form relationships and have social public life there. And so as I learned about these characteristics, as I reflected on the third place, and I reflected on my work with cooperative inquiry, I began to see a lot of connections there, right? So for example, in the third place, one of the big things is that there's no hierarchy, right? So there's not a boss and then the underlings and things like that. Everyone kind of has equal say in the environment, equal opportunities to contribute to the social interactions. Whereas in cooperative inquiry, our goal is to engage children as design partners. And so there's a lot of things that we do, techniques that we use to engage children as equal design partners. And you don't see it here, but oftentimes in cooperative inquiry, we all sit on the floor in a circle at the beginning. Adults, the children, the kids say how old they are, the adults say how old they are, right, how long they've been with the team. We wear jeans, we dress down, things like that, so that, to make sure that everyone is kind of on equal footing. And so that's just one example of ways that the third places map to cooperative inquiry. And so as I began to see these connections, especially as I was thinking about my work in the long run, I began to map out what I call third place design. So in third place design, what we do is we actually situate the participatory design or the cooperative inquiry in the environments in which those tools and those activities would happen. So instead of having kids come to the university and have the technology designers come to the university, we actually go out into the community and we go out to the after school program and we go out into the classroom and we situate the participatory design there, and we work with children who also have experience in those specific contexts who can give that specific contextual understanding to their design ideas. But I also saw with this approach the need to really begin to engage not only the kids in the design process, but to also engage the adults as well, right? The whole community, right? So to engage the informal educators, to engage the teachers, to engage the community mentors, right? Like all of the parents in this participatory design process. And so with that, I call that third place design, and that's what has taken shape in these two projects, Science Everywhere and NatureNet. So in both of these projects, we're leveraging social media tools and community display tools to help the whole community come together to engage in science and scientific practices. In the Science Everywhere program, we're developing these tools to help children make connections, in particular children in low socioeconomic communities. We're working with two, one in Maryland and one in Seattle, where the children are using social media tools and community displays to connect the science, to capture and share the science that they're doing across home, school, and after-school environments. And so we are, oh, I'm sorry, here you go. So this is a video here to show you. I don't have a lot of time to share a lot about the Science Everywhere program, but here's a short video to show you more about what we're doing.
You get to learn more beyond what we regularly do.
See what science is and everything.
So with this project, we're imagining a future where information will be all around us, on the walls, on mobile devices, carried around with us. And we're trying to figure out how we might leverage that information and what young people are sharing in their everyday life.
We've been working on the project for almost 2 years now, and some of the things that we've accomplished are a social media app that children have access to. We've distributed iPods to about 45 students. We actually meet weekly with the children in these communities, and we actually meet about monthly with the parents. We also meet with the teachers at the school that the program is part of. Because we're developing this socio-technical system to help children begin to do what I call scientize in their daily lives. What is scientizing? Well, scientizing is when you're able to recognize the applicability of science in your everyday life. And when you see science in your everyday life, you begin to use it, whether that's, if you're at home in the kitchen trying to make bread with yeast and things like that, or whether you're out in nature and you're thinking about pollution and watersheds and how what you do in your everyday life affects the nature around you. Scientizing is recognizing the relevance of science in those situations and then beginning to do your own new investigations and your own new experiments to advance your knowledge and the knowledge of those around you.
So currently, the next steps are to essentially put up the large screens. That's really exciting to see.
There will be a large display of the local school centers that we're working in, the local schools that we're working in, perhaps the local libraries, other community places that will actually display the posts that the children are creating as they engage in science in their everyday lives. And what we hope is that these large displays will be systems that display the funds of knowledge of an entire community, an entire neighborhood.
And so one of the parents talked about how growing up she was in America, right? So growing up in the country she was from, they always were taught that scientists were like, they built rockets and they were doctors, right? But she didn't realize that like everyone could be a scientist. And so by participating in the program, she mentioned that like now she sees that science is everywhere, and she sees that like everyone should be a scientist, and it's kind of democratized science for these parents as well as with the kids.
Oh, so isn't that wonderful working with you guys, the students? Oh, outside of the classroom doing science stuff.
Okay, and so since that video was created, we actually have created and developed this and incorporated the community displays in the different contexts. So here you see it at the local church that we're partners with in Riverdale, Maryland, and the kids in the community can use it to capture and share the science learning that they're doing. And we have we've recently submitted a paper to CHI 2018 for that particular work. So the next project is called NatureNet. And in NatureNet, we're using technologies to support environmental learning. And this is actually a project that is collaborative with researchers at the University of Maryland, including my co-PI, Jenny Priest, researchers at University of Colorado Boulder and UNC Charlotte. And so in this particular project, this is another first for me, we're doing adult learning. And adult learning is a little bit different because adults have more autonomy to decide what they're going to do and engage in. And they also have lots of competing responsibilities, right? Many of us know about those, right? And so therefore the motivation for engaging in informal learning is a little bit different. So it's really important then that we begin to understand within these contexts, right? Like how can learning happen in these adult learning contexts, and what are the challenges that learners face, and what are the ways that new technologies might support this particular type of learning. And so environmental learning actually provides us with a really rich and right opportunity to understand some of these because people live in the environment, right? So it affects us, it affects the air that we breathe, the water we drink, and all these kinds of things. And in fact, it also provides us with an opportunity to broaden participation in science and environmental studies specifically, as many have found that many people are not informed about the issues of water quality in their environments, right? And that affects people, especially in low socioeconomic underrepresented communities, disproportionately, right? So this is an opportunity to engage people in matters that really that are really resonant in their everyday lives. And research has shown that we can that we can design new place-based social media tools and tools that will help children to begin to engage in environmental practices and studies. Here we see an example of the Science Everywhere project, where the children learned about some environmental stormwater management properties and practices, right, that they could do in their own communities, and they actually posted about it later as they connected it back to their own neighborhoods and homes. But we really need to understand this in the context of adult learning as well, and how we can motivate this participation. So we were trying to understand how adult community-driven environmental projects happen, like how does that learning happen, and what are the supports that are needed. And I'm kind of going to go through this a little bit fast because I think I'm running a little bit short on time. Is that right? Oh, okay. I want to make sure I leave time for questions. But so for this project, we're working with the Anacostia Watershed Society in a program that they have called Watershed Stewards Academy. And the Watershed Stewards Academy, what they're doing is they're trying to equip individuals to be leaders with respect to stormwater management in their communities. So the participants go through a 12-session course, and then they actually carry out their own capstone projects in their community where they get others involved in stormwater management practices. And the idea is that they then become master watershed stewards, where they're people who will take on these practices in their everyday lives and become leaders in their communities in this way. And so the Watershed Stewards Academy actually took an approach of situating themselves in faith-based institutions to reach a more broad, diverse audience. And so we use the concept of affinity spaces to understand learning in this context, right? So in the affinity spaces are these interest-based contexts where people come together for various expertises and domains and things like that, and they engage in a rich problem-solving context. Typically, this has been done in the context of gaming or online fan fiction sites and things like that. And they also have these interest-driven sites or back channels where they can go and find out more information and have more community collaboration based on their interests. And so I just wanted to kind of pause here to say I've used a lot of theories in this talk today, and just kind of say how they map out, right? Like with when we were looking at the LPSV, the Body Viz project, we used activity theory because we're really trying to understand how all of the parts of the ecosystem come together to promote a hybrid space. But in the third place context, we're using the concept of affinity spaces, especially in this community-driven environmental learning project context, because it maps really well to the learning approach that we have of helping people to design their own projects in the context of their environment and their community. So the rich problem context in the Watershed Stewards Academy is the context of stormwater management, right? And stormwater management practices so that you don't pollute the water. And the interest-driven sites are the fact that the participants can actually come together around their own interests and do their own projects that they're interested in. So affinity spaces actually provide participants with low-risk opportunities to actually begin to engage in a practice and engage in learning. And they have three types of diversity, right? So there's diversity with domain orientation. So people come from many different disciplines, right? Like in the Watershed Stewards Academy, you have teachers, you have environmentalists, You have people who are just hobbyists, right, like bartenders and things like that, who just see the need for this type of work. And you have different ways of engaging, right, different ways that you can contribute to the community, and different roles that you can take on within the community. So we did a lot of work in the context. I'm not going to go really deep into this because I know I'm running short on time, but we did focus groups and interviews with current and past watershed stewards to understand how their learning happened. And we analyzed this data using a mix of deductive and inductive coding. And with respect to how learning happens, we found that the participants developed an awareness of stormwater management practices in the 12-week course, and then that they began to fuel their passion with the capstone project in stormwater management practices, and that some then reported that they became a community force, right, or community or leaders in their community. And so this happened as they, in the 12-week program, they learned about how pollution enters into our waterways, right, through rainwater carrying pollution into the waterways. And they learned about ways that they could prevent this from happening. And so they began to think about like how that actually related to their own communities and their own neighborhoods and policies and things like that in their neighborhoods and communities. And then they began to fuel their passions with their capstone projects, right? And so they, the watershed stewards particularly began to do projects that related to their own interests, their own neighborhoods, and their own professions. And one key thing that had to happen here was that the Watershed Stewards Academy leader recognized that he needed to broaden the range of topics that could be considered. So he said that at first, participants were only encouraged to do what they call shovel in the ground projects, but then he had to broaden that range, right? So people could connect their projects to policies, they could connect their projects to actually like curriculum development if they were teachers and things like that. And once they did that, participants began to really develop more rich connections to their projects. And some participants reported that they began to consider themselves kind of like a community force. So they began to take on leadership by educating others, whether it was just their family members or their broader community. And they began to see themselves and the water differently through this process. But they also had challenges working in this space, right? Motivating adults, right? So oftentimes there was transients in the community spaces that they worked with, like the organizations that they were working with. So as soon as they found a community partner that was interested, they often had to, they often left and they had to kind of start over. But they also had to manage people's competing priorities, right? So people, even if they cared about the environment, they also had all these other things, responsibilities that they had to take care of. And they needed help developing connections with the community and motivating people to participate in their projects. And so they reported that they began to address these challenges through connecting to community members' missions and their values and goals and things like that. So they had to actually do the research to find out what they were interested, what the community organizations were interested in, and mapping their projects to those interests, and through collaborating with one another. And so one thing that we found throughout our work in the context has been that there are these dynamic interactions that arise between stewards whenever they get together, whether it's in a focus group or whether it's in the actual program itself, right? So for example, when in our field notes one time we saw that this particular quote says, when Barbara and Marion learned that John has no connection to a church that he hoped to contact regarding land use issues, they both took their phones and looked at the church website to see how the church was organized and suggested a point of contact for John. They also tactfully implied that an older white man should proceed delicately with such discussions in a largely African-American church with which he had no connections. Providing needed housing services to their congregants might seem more important than the loss of a few trees to them. So the community began to kind of help one another with this process. And so now I want to kind of skip here, because basically what we're saying is that, what we're learning is that we want to help participants begin to make these transitions from these individual projects to more macro community-wide considerations and actions, right? But they need more support, and so we're looking at ways that that technologies can support this, right? And so we found that technology, through doing design work with our participants in this program, that technologies need to help learners to understand stormwater management practices and to communicate and interact with one another. And so that's what we're currently working on, and I'm going to kind of skip through here. That's what we're currently working on with our NatureNet app. So here you can see the app where participants can take photos and they can share, and it gives them a map-based visualization of where those photos were taken. And we're also looking into ways that people can actually include data, so they can capture data for their projects with this tool. And then there's also a website and kiosk site that we're putting out in the community, and that participants can access from their homes, that will allow them to see the data as well there, but to also map to different projects and to different community members, so they can have these discussions across groups. And we're working in 2 contexts, so not only the Watershed Stewards Academy in Maryland, but also at the Reedy Creek Nature Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the emphasis is more on recreation, and we're learning about how these community-driven projects can evolve in both of these different contexts. Okay, so that concludes the work with third spaces. And so kind of to come back to the hybrid spaces and third place connection, in my work I found that hybrid spaces can inspire and enable new types of scientizing practices and experiences. And then third places are the places where these scientizing practices can develop across contexts, right? And so learners need technologies that help them to capture, share, and build upon their scientific experiences within the community. And so now just a second about my future work. What I really want to do is go even deeper into the community. And I especially, like, this is kind of right now it's kind of just a pipe dream. You know, that's that goal is a dream until you write it down. So this is my writing it down, right? Like, I really want to go deeper, go to the learners themselves. So oftentimes we think of having an after school program or something like that where learners come to us, or having a school where learners actually come to us to learn. But what I want to do is go out to where people already are engaging naturally and felicitously, right? And I specifically, I've become a new football fan recently, and I'm a big Carolina Panthers fan. And so what I want to do is do an ethnographic study in a set of football contexts, so that I can see what are the rich opportunities that we have for leveraging technologies and leveraging life-relevant learning, so that participants can begin to think about science and scientific engagement and practice in this context. And I imagine also going into other contexts like churches and places where you already have this rich engagement, identity connection. There's diverse audiences engaged in these spaces, right, and collaborating. And so what are the ways that we can leverage these spaces to promote learning? So I want to develop new life-relevant learning contexts and study the scientizing disposition and identity development in those spaces. So with that, I would like to thank all of my awesome collaborators on Science Everywhere, NatureNet, and the Body Vids Project. I would also like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this work, and all of our amazing participants. And I would like to open the floor for questions. Oh, yes, thank you.
So I have kind of an activity theory question, because that's something that I wrestle with too. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you conceptualize your role as the researcher in the activity system. In part because, so when I read activity theory things, they're talking about adults in adult places, right? Hospitals, Xerox, all those things. So everyone has a presumed sort of opportunity for agency. But in schools, that's not the case, right? There's the teacher that has a lot of power, and there's the student that typically don't. And so I'm wondering, like, how you conceptualize yourself as someone who can sort of bridge that power divide.
No, yeah, that was a great question, because I guess in some ways we did, right? So when I, like on that bottom of the triangle where we had like teacher and facilitator roles, right? Like we as the researchers on the Body Vids team were the facilitators. And we did participatory design with the teachers, and you're right that like so and I didn't get to talk about this, but we actually have done 2 iterations of the study with the same teacher. So we did it 1 year in 2016, and then we did it last school year as well. I only reported on the first year, but one thing that we found was that like so we took a lot of the agency for the teaching, right, like in the first year, and then we like handed that over a little bit more to the teachers in the second year. And I think that that's kind of why we got that first quote, right? That was like, hey, I wanted them to be sitting in their seats, and I wanted them to be, you know, kind of doing these different things. But I think just the tools themselves kind of lend themselves to that kind of agency, right? Because you know that the kids are actually doing investigations around their own personal bodies, so then that makes it so that they can bring in these personal contexts, and it kind of gives it more credence to say, hey, I want to use, can I use food, or can I use candy, or can I use these other things that I'm really interested in. So yeah, we haven't quite figured all of that out yet, and that's why we're still like kind of looking at those classroom doors to understand that a little bit better. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, what sort of questions were the students coming up with to test during their 4 days?
Yeah, so my favorite was the one with the kids dancing, and so that was like, how does the nay-nay affect my heart rate? So yeah, and this is a first grade class, and so they actually had to think about, they wanted to do the reverse nay-nay, and so they had to think about like, well, we don't really know how to do that, and so then they had to like draw their procedures and things like that. Some other questions were some ones you saw in the video where they were looking at how do different exercises, so a lot of them looked at different exercises or different types of sports. Some of them want to know like how does eating candy affect my heart rate. Some of them asked about homework, like what about when I do homework, or we've had kids ask about like doing different yoga poses versus doing like a high intensity exercise or things like that. So, and it's interesting because the first year that we did it, the kids, especially the younger kids, would have questions that were not really testable, right? So for example, they say, well, I want to know how does poison affect my body? You can't test that.
It's bad.
Yeah. So what we did was we designed a set of scaffolds that helped them to think about what a testable question is. And so we had like 3 criteria. Like it had to be able to be done in a minute, and then it had to be able to be done in the classroom, which wasn't a criteria the first year. So sometimes the kids would go in the hall, or we would allow them to go in the courtyard and things like that. And then it had to be testable with our body viz or shared viz tools. So.
Not dangerous.
But not dangerous, yeah. We didn't put that in there, but that was kind of, kind of assuming, so, yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. So you said one of the findings in the BioVis study was that the first graders like reported using kind of scientific inquiry less than the fourth graders did? Like, is that the number 24% that I'm remembering? So
well, they said that they enjoyed it. I mean, so that was looking at the percentage of kids that talked about enjoying scientific practices. So one of the questions that we asked them on the assessment was, what was your favorite part of the activity today? And then we coded that for scientific inquiry practices versus other.
And were the first graders, just indulge me, I mean, I don't know anything about, studying young students like that. Like, are they literally writing it down and then you're coding those things, or are you talking with them, or?
Both, yeah. So we did both. So we did pre and post assessments, right? And which is typically not the norm of what I do, but we saw the utility of it here in the classroom. And so we asked the kids, like, what was your favorite part of the activity? We had a couple of open-ended questions. We had a couple of multiple choice that was like, we showed them pictures of the shared phys graph. And we said, like Tammy and all the research team members' names and whose heart rate was the highest, and things like that. And then, so we had them answer those questions there. A lot of times with the younger kids, we had to work with them, kind of go around and write for them sometimes, like write what they told us or things like that, because writing is definitely more of a challenge, right? But then we also did focus groups with the kids on the last day of the program as well. And so we had each group that worked together on their Choice Day project. We had each of them sit down at table with one of the researchers, and we asked them questions like that as well. So yeah, that gave them more opportunity to say what they were thinking.
One more question.
Yes.
So you mentioned that part of your motivation for this work was your own experience of engaging in activities that motivate you to become interested in science. Are you planning to study longer-term impacts of these kinds of interventions in terms of students' participation, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, with the Science Everywhere project, we've actually been running the project for 4 years. And for 4 years, we pretty much had the same group of learners in the program. And so we're definitely doing that type of work, right, where we're like, interviewing with the kids. We're like looking at the social media posts that they create. We're interviewing their parents and their teachers and things like that, like to see what their experiences are. And this is like deep community work that we're looking at, like, how do we extend it? How do we keep it going? And so I don't envision like losing. I mean, working with these kids for 4 years, I'm not going to just like, hey, there you go, right? So I want to keep track of them, and then and keep working with them to see how they're developing over time. We have one learner who's just off the top of my mind, I'm thinking of who's he's an immigrant student, not English as a second language student, And he has been telling us, you know, a lot that like he that nobody in his family had to finish high school, so he doesn't plan on finishing high school. But he's been engaging in this Science Everywhere project for a while now. And, by the end of his first year engaging in it, he got like an award for like the most improved in the science class. His teacher was also a participant in a partner with us in the program and things like that. And so I definitely want to follow these trajectories to see, well, what does he end up doing? Because to me, I hope he doesn't continue to have that. You know, even if he has that perspective, that he just keeps taking another step, right, until he actually graduates. So I really, my plan is to follow them and to maintain the community with them, really.
Dr. Clegg, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.